Hello, everyone, as we slowly make our way into the virtual town hall for our fortnightly tech talk. Lovely to see you all on this Friday. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm the director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology, and we run these talks on the politics of technology as part of the Australia at Home series every fortnight. I hope that most of you are return guests, but if anyone's here for the first time, welcome. Before we get cracking, I do want to pay respects to traditional owners of the land we're all on around Australia. I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora people in Sydney. I pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging. I won't go through the ground rules, you guys know it. Cameras on if you can, use the chat, introduce yourself, and let's dive into what should be another great discussion. Now, our guest today, our regular guest, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch, still bunkered down in Melbourne. And this week, Dan, who's not bunkered down in Melbourne, is actually gone down to the Margaret River in Perth, the bastard. But we're really lucky to have subbing in Josh Taylor from Guardian Australia, who's also bunkered down in Melbourne. So Lizzie, Josh, welcome to you both. Before we get into our discussions, and we have promised that this isn't going to be a replay of the last two tech talks and just talk about the platforms inquiry, but it has, that issue is still evolving. Lizzie's organisation, Digital Rights Watch, put out their submission, and you might want to put that in the chat, and I'll give you 2 minutes to talk about your contrary position to mine in a moment, Lizzie. But first, Josh, interested in your view of that debate from the cheap seats. And also, Josh is one of the technology reporters at Guardian Australia, and you can explain this better to me. There's a number of you that work in this space, but you tend to get the juicy stories. I'm just interested what it's like covering big tech in Australia at a moment like this.
I think The Guardian has probably about, 4 or 5 dedicated technology reporters in the US, UK, and Australia. I'm the only one in Australia that, I'm notionally a general reporter, but I have an interest in technology. And my background is technology reporting. So that's where I've come from. It's kind of interesting that in terms, when you're dealing with technology companies, there tends to be that every story is a global story. So I often find in our patch, because we are a global news organization, a lot of the stories, the day-to-day stuff is usually handled from US or UK. Where it gets interesting for us where it intersects with politics and Australia in general. So, if there's, the digital platform stuff, if there's, data retention, if there's regulation plan, if there's a massive cyber attack, or if there's a data breach and stuff like that, that's usually where the local angle comes in. Or if there's stuff like, Facebook groups, playing anti-lockdown process, stuff like that, that's usually where it comes into play for me.
Do you feel like you're in the centre of the universe, though, at the moment, with both Google and Facebook threatening to take their platforms and go home?
Yeah, a little bit. It's a very interesting time to be reporting on that, because it's essentially reporting on something that would directly affect me as well. So it's an interesting one to watch in that respect. But I think it's such a strange time, because Google and Facebook have made threats like these before in terms of having to deal with regulation in other parts of the world, but I've never seen such a strong campaign as they have sort of been waging in the past few weeks. And, we're all looking at that October deadline for Facebook threatening to remove news content in Australia and what that would actually look like in practice. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks to see where that all goes.
Can I ask, Josh, I do wonder how journos break these kinds of stories, and whether you think it's, it is somewhere you have to be in Silicon Valley to do this, because we'll talk in a minute about a memo released by a Facebook staffer, and staffers are actually seem to be an increasing source of the insider knowledge about how these platforms work, and kind of breaching that facade of how their companies like to present themselves. And it turns out she waived a termination payment of around $65,000 to be able to speak, to avoid a non-disparagement clause. But I wondered if you could talk about whether you think that is the place in which stories are broken, and how hard it must be, I think, being not in that zone, and why it's still important to have reporters in Australia.
Yeah, so I think particularly with those big companies, you do need to have a presence in Silicon Valley, just to be, it's similar to like when you're working in the press gallery in Canberra, you get so much more out of being around the people day to day, you know, socializing with them. You hear so much more stuff than if you're doing it remotely, say from Melbourne at the moment. So I definitely do think that helps. The tech companies traditionally have been a fairly sort of closed ship, and it's only really in the last few months, particularly in Facebook, that you're starting to see that open up. And I think, you know, those NDA clauses and the non-disparagement clauses and things like that have been extremely powerful in keeping people silent. But I think the tipping point seemed to be a few months ago when all the people because Facebook doesn't do it themselves, all the moderators started speaking out and started, you know, talking about how they were basically suffering from PTSD and things like that. And I think that started to have an impact on people feeling like they needed to speak up more and talk about this monster that they'd created.
Lizzie, before we do dive into the Facebook memo, you put your submission in the chat. We're not going to spend, as I said, the hour talking about the platforms, but do you want to just give us the 2-minute version and where you'd like to see this thing land?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're welcome to read it. It's not super long, and hopefully it sets out the issues pretty clearly. We're obviously a critic of the code. We think it's important to have a flourishing media landscape here in Australia, and we also think it's really important that people are able to use social media platforms and that it's an important source of news for people. Well, I suppose we're just talking about the ways that we think it could improve, and we're a bit worried about things like entrenching existing power brokers within the traditional media landscape and how that might be problematic. Also entrenching a model of doing business in terms of sharing links online that is focused on data and data collection, which we see is pretty insidious to our democracy and our public discussion. So we just talk a little bit about it, acknowledging that there is a problem, but that we're not sure that this code necessarily is the solution that we need. And we think there's ways in which it could change, and that's the idea behind this stuff.
Yeah, Rod Sims ran one of these events on the Australia Institute's Economic Talks platform yesterday, and it was interesting. He was very much saying there are some fundamentals on the code, but he still sees a fair bit of change coming. And I think that particularly that piece of excluding ABC and SBS is really going to be up for negotiations. The Greens have come out in the last week, and I didn't realise this until earlier this week. News Limited actually also supports having ABC and SBS covered by the code. Go figure, but mainly because in their view the code won't work if there is a significant part of the media that's not covered by it. So I think Josh is right. The next few weeks are going to be critical. Last question on that. Do you feel that the eyes of particularly America, through the interest that your international guardian is giving to this story, do you think it is being sort of watched closely internationally?
I think this is possibly, it's the first of its kind in the world, which I think is why they're fighting against it so strongly, because they know that if it works here, if it does, if Google and Facebook can't get out of essentially paying news media companies, then other countries are going to follow suit. And I think that's what they're mainly worried about. I found some of the stuff that Rod Sims was saying the other day, like particularly around BuzzFeed, when he said that he thought that, you know, BuzzFeed would have been saved by, you know, having this in place. I took a redundancy at BuzzFeed a year ago, and my understanding of the way the structure of the company works, I don't think that it was necessarily about paying into Australia. I think BuzzFeed's model was very different to traditional media outlets, and I think it's more of a VC tech type company rather than a media company. And I think that it was a sort of a gross simplification of you know, thinking of BuzzFeed as sort of a traditional news outlet that just shut due to lack of revenue. But I'll be interested to see. I would be fascinated to see whether the government actually explains why ABC and SBS were excluded, because it seems from the face of it just part of a culture war type thing. But I'm not sure about that.
Well, speaking of your old colleagues at BuzzFeed, it was quite a scoop this week. The memo from a former data scientist, Sophie Zhang, which really documented, or the coverage from BuzzFeed documents her discomfort at effectively playing global diplomat and having to, at what I imagine was not a particularly senior level of the company, be responsible for shutting down orchestrated disinformation in a whole bunch of countries, from Azerbaijan, Honduras, India, Ukraine, Spain, Bolivia. It sounds like the old CIA fields of operation in the 80s, but this time you've got people not in the State Department, but in Facebook, responsible for keeping things nice. The fact that Facebook has actually got a team called the Facebook Site Integrity Fake Engagement Team says a lot about where we are today. And so I guess there's a lot in this memo, but maybe firstly just that idea that Facebook is kind of setting up this geopolitical infrastructure inside its business and probably doing it like everything else as cheaply as possible, Lizzie.
Yeah, completely. I really feel for the woman who wrote this memo. She's a data scientist. She was probably a mid-level employee, and she feels like she wasn't supported to do the work that she was doing, which seems to have had an enormous impact on a number of different countries and their democratic processes, the ones that you talked about before. And so for a variety of reasons, that's problematic. She's being forced to kind of choose which areas of focus the company works on, which countries, for example, they might focus on in terms of trying to address disinformation, and which countries they don't have the resources to do. And she is a data scientist, so she's applying a particular skill set when clearly it's a kind of problem that requires cross-disciplinary responses and people with lots of different skill sets to be able to comment and do it in a nuanced way. I really think what's clear from this is that the company doesn't support moderation of this kind significantly or to the extent necessary given that the power that they wield. But also, I think moderation of these kinds of public discussions is immensely difficult. It's a very thorny political question. I think more resources would help. I think it's a big problem that Facebook, for example, as far as I know, it may have changed since I last read about this, but doesn't have moderators in every country in which their platform is available. It has to moderate in many different languages, and it's got to moderate in quite nuanced political environments. And for that reason, it's a very difficult job. And I think that's one of the ways that the company makes money, not properly investing in these processes. And that's something we need to remember, because it does explain why someone like her is put in this position and basically sounds like having some form of PTSD as a result, and is trying to raise these points, I think, in quite a brave way to say, we need to do something about this as a company. It was an internal memo. It wasn't as though she went to the media directly. I mean, it's been reported, and I think that's really important. But she's really making a pitch to her colleagues as well that they need to take this seriously, and I think that is a very important contribution to the discussion.
Josh, it's almost like it's calling out what is obvious in that a platform that has unmediated content at the front end without the resources to actually keep some form of guidelines or guardrails in place is going to have this level of exploitation. It seems like what's extraordinary is that it's extraordinary.
I think it just goes back to how Facebook has kind of always viewed moderation in general. It's basically this annoyance for them and not something that they particularly want to do. It's outsourced outside the company. So you don't really get that understanding of for the most part, it's outsourced out of the company. You don't really get that understanding of what is happening in other parts of the world and what people should be paying attention to, because you basically got these people who have no contact with the company outside of the moderation that they're doing, and it's not really filtering back. And I think it just comes back to the idea that, I think Facebook now is more a moderation company first and foremost, more than anything else. And unfortunately, their attitude over time by saying that, if we moderate all this stuff and bring it down, we're impacting free speech, unfortunately is a position, and it is leaning to certain sides. And we're only just seeing that now. It's gone through so many other countries, and I think the US and other English speaking Western nations are only starting to get an understanding of what's been happening everywhere else in the world now that it's happening in our countries as well.
There's been two analogies for Facebook. One is the publisher, where they're responsible for content. The other is it's more like a utility, where their responsibility is to keep, the water clean, or, the power flowing through in a safe way. But neither analogy quite comprehends an idea that you flood the field and then you try to clean it up in advance. And that's where I wonder, Lizzie, whether it is actually fixable or if the entire unmediated front-end model is the problem and there's just no way of fixing it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I saw someone respond to the journalist who tweeted the article out on his feed from Facebook, who was quite dismissive of this memo and said, oh, she's talking about fake likes and that's with respect, that's not our biggest concern. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but, we focus on harm minimization and we have automated processes for dealing with fake likes. And so the company's response seems to be, we can automate moderation. And in fact, we have very sophisticated programs for doing so. And that's what our competitive advantage is. That's why we offer good things, because we can provide this service and we have sophisticated tools for moderating. And I just think it's really clear that that's not going to cut it, that it's very difficult to automate moderation of public debate. It's, the nature of public debate, of a flourishing media landscape, is that it has dialogue and discussion and it's got language specific idioms and all these kinds of things that make any kind of automated tool pretty inappropriate for the task. And I just think it strikes me as a very classic kind of tech utopian vision. Oh, we'll automate this problem and it'll go away. And I think Josh is right. They are now really focused on moderation. They have to be. I think partly because they're going to start to look more and more down the barrel of regulation. And while I say that it's very difficult to moderate these questions, I do think they have tools at their disposal that could show that they were making an effort. And to my mind, I think that's what they'll start to do. They'll start to say, we are making an effort to deal with this. You don't need to regulate us. We'll get on top of this problem. But I do think there is things that they could do. And, things like limiting virality, things like stopping, kinds of the use of their own algorithms to incentivize, inflammatory content, I should say. There's all sorts of things I think they could be doing on the back end in quite a public way. I think that would be best. That would allow us to have a discussion about what kinds of limits we should have on publishing like this, on being able to allow people to publish things, because obviously there's very important advantages in allowing people to publish directly onto a platform like this. And if you look at something like the Black Lives Matter movement, you can see that straight away. Being able to publish video, for example, of a policeman shooting someone or kneeling on their neck is quite critical to our public discussions around police violence. However, we do have to contend with the fact that their platform and how it's designed has an enormous impact on our democracy. And I think we're going to have to start having public discussions about what their responsibilities are, what plans they have for limiting the worst excesses of their platforms, while also protecting the very important contribution it makes to a flourishing democracy.
I think part of the big problem as well is a lot of the stuff that's happening now is not public. The worst stuff that happens on Facebook, we aren't seeing anymore because they're in these closed groups that get hundreds of thousands, millions of members. And it often takes Facebook quite a while to actually do anything about them. I think I know I was in one of these groups that had something like 200,000 members, this anti-lockdown group. And, they were posting so much QAnon, so much fake news stuff, getting people riled up. And it was only sort of after the protest started to happen that Facebook actually took a measure to start taking them down. So it was sort of a typical Facebook response when they started to move to closed groups, where their move to address an issue was basically just to hide it and take out the PR issue. And then I think that's how they've always dealt with moderation, is just to think of it as a PR issue, and often relying on journalists to get into these groups now and point out, hey, there's all this really bad stuff going on. You should do something about it before something actually happens.
The question kind of is a platform of this scale now redeemable, or is it fundamentally like, a bit of, in a chat, a few people are saying genie's out of the bottle. You can't do anything about it now. Now that's not acceptable. So, Congress has spoken a bit in the States, and maybe if there's a change of, president of breaking it up under antitrust or something like that, I guess in a way, regardless of whether we think the media code's the right idea, there's kind of a bit of a sense there it is too big a presence in terms of the media, and that's part of what's driving the ACCC. Is there a world in which you can see governments moving to break Facebook up or reduce its influence?
I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes. Elizabeth Warren was campaigning on breaking up big tech, obviously, and she's dropped out of the race, of course. But I do think, we're going to talk about this in a bit, but there's a public support for changing our current online engagement with platforms, and people don't feel that their privacy is properly protected. So there's public appetite there. I think that can take the form of regulatory reform, but it will require, I think, that we have advocates who do kind of make a claim as to what it should look like, rather than just relying on those CEOs of the companies to design the regulation themselves. And I do think that companies are on top of this. Like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg wrote that op-ed in the Washington Post. I mean, it must be a year ago now, where he talked about the need to regulate Facebook. We have too much power. So, you know, they've been, I think, doing the work to figure out what that regulation might look like. But I think it's pretty clear that you could, for example, quite easily up big tech by stopping Facebook continuing to be able to operate Instagram and WhatsApp, which they own. I mean, that's an obvious way in which you could do that and stop the sharing of data between those platforms. There's bigger reforms that, of course, I've talked about many times, but lots of people have discussed about trying to limit micro-targeting and advertising of that nature, trying to give people more power to say that I hand over information for a specific purpose. It shouldn't be used for any other purpose. There's ways you could definitely limit the ad model of big tech. I mean, that's going to be pretty radical and transformative. But I think that is at the heart of the problem here. These platforms are designed around that model, and a lot of the problems, not all of them, but a lot of them flow from that. So I think at some point we're going to have to contend with it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sorry, go Josh.
I was just going to say, it will be interesting to see if there is a change of leadership in the US, whether that actually comes into effect, because, you know, we've seen with Trump how quickly he can, you know, attempt to force a sale of TikTok just because it's not American. What could someone who wasn't doing it from a nationalistic point of view actually achieve in the US if he wanted to, or if they wanted to, you know, do something about social media companies and tech companies in general in the US if they were saying, you know, no, this is not working, you're too big. I think along the lines of separating out the business units like Instagram and WhatsApp and maybe even Messenger might be a good one to break out as well, would be an interesting move. But I think it's one of those things that I think that the tech companies have gotten so big and are now really, really good at lobbying in the US, and maybe not so much here. It seems to be a little not as effective here, but they will fight this as long as they can, I think.
Yeah, look, I think they're doing a full court press in Australia at the moment. The effectiveness we will have to see in a few weeks' time, which, you know, you've got your regulatory response, and then you've also got, you know, their human networks, and whether there is a moment where social license starts sort of being compromised. I thought the really interesting development in the last fortnight was this video of a poor soul committing suicide that went viral through schools. I don't think we should underestimate the impact of that just in terms of retail. So for those, firstly, I want to be really sensitive in the way I talk about this, because suicide's really, you know, triggering, and, you know, you've got to be sensitive. But there was a guy who committed suicide and live streamed it to Facebook. It sat there for the best part of a day before it was taken down, but in that time it was copied and repurposed. And about a week ago it turned up warnings coming through schools that it had been repurposed into content on both TikTok and Instagram. On Instagram it was embedded in a cat video. It got embedded in a Mario video on YouTube. And it was kind of like this thing that it was totally, once it was up there, it kind of, you know, went viral, but totally out of control. And so there was also mixed messages coming through to parents. I've got teenage kids, so we're at the receiving end of it. There was some advice, say, from the E-Safety Commissioner, be aware of it, but don't talk about it. There were other schools saying, talk about it. There was one school threatening to expel kids who shared it. So there's a whole lot of different ways they were trying to deal with it. The bottom line was, it kind of really, I think, reinforced to parents or myself that an unregulated network has huge consequences. And whether that kind of moment, whether it just passes or not, I just think it created a little line in the sand where people went, oh shit, you know, this stuff is real. And really, really distressing stuff as well.
Yeah, and I don't know what you'd actually do about that. It was one of those ones where, I mean, everyone who was on those platforms had seen some variation of it in such a short amount of time, and it was such a huge thing that everyone was aware of. How do you actually make sure that I think the mechanisms that the tech companies had in place eventually did kick in properly. I haven't seen much of it since, although I haven't really been looking for it. But yeah, it's not really clear about how you actually go about preventing that from being spread around. Like they've got the systems in place to fingerprint these types of videos and bring them down before they get put up. But people will always find a way around it. That's just the nature of the internet. And I'm not 100% sure. I think I wrote a story basically saying the Christchurch legislation that the federal government passed last year wouldn't have been used in that because the abhorrent violent material definition doesn't actually include suicide. But I'm not exactly sure that is the mechanism that should be used to bring that kind of content down anyway. I thought that legislation was quite rushed when it was brought in. And it seemed that, the ECFD commissioner didn't really need to issue any directions or anything like that because it was taken down. I think, and it is interesting that it raised a broader point about how the internet has changed as well. A lot of the discussion, 10, 15 years ago was about blocking websites with harmful content and things like that from being able to view. And that is still a portion of the discussion around the internet. And I'm pretty sure there will probably be an internet filtering debate in the next year or two. But so much of what we're talking about now is less about the individual websites and more what is on these platforms themselves.
Yeah.
Josh, you generously said, I thought that was a bit rushed, the Abhorrent Violent Material Act. I think it was tabled for 4 days before it was passed, or something astonishing like that. So for people who don't know, it's this legislation that essentially imposes very serious fines and I think even criminal offences, I can't recall to be honest, for companies that host abhorrent violent material, and it's defined in a particular way. But to my read, we talked about the relationship between politicians and big tech. That was a perfect example where politicians were just like, we're not going to deal with the fact that we have white supremacists. We're going to offload this problem entirely onto big tech and say, oh, you can come up with an algorithm to fix this problem, as though that's really how you deal with this kind of thing. It's astonishing to my mind. I think it was kind of interesting how quickly someone like a platform like Facebook got that content down from the Christchurch shooter, and that a lot of platforms worked similarly very quickly to do that. And I genuinely think within these companies, they don't want this content on there. It's not as though it's of any benefit to them, and they do work hard to try and take it down, but it's a very difficult task. And so it's very convenient for politicians to just kind of outsource that to companies and then wash their hands of it. There's obviously social reasons why this stuff happens too, and political ones, and politicians are less keen to kind of contend with why that might be true or how they might contribute to that as well, which is pretty disappointing. But yeah, I think it's a really challenging question. I think someone talked in the chat there about Lucy's just pointed out, I think it was 48 hours that it took to get that content down in relation to the Christchurch shooting. But someone talked in the chat there about digital literacy education for children, and I do think that is partly what we have to invest in, helping kids understand how platforms work and how you can be someone who's responsible for your own safety, and not imposing that as the only obligation that we have in respect to safety, but allowing people to be consumers of internet content in a thoughtful way. And that goes for both sharing as well as what you might encounter online. And I think that is got to be part of the equation. And there are really good programs. The Safety Commission does do a lot of good work, I think, in terms of building digital literacy for kids. And I would like to see more of that. I think we could also do digital literacy training for older people too. And that's what I would like to see. And the Safety Commission has talked a little bit about that. They've got a great report on older people, and I think we could invest more in that. But I think that's part of it, like learning to contend with these platforms and how they work, so that you can be both a consumer and a share of content in a thoughtful way.
I think it's not just that as well. It's also just the content and consuming. I think the thing that's shown me through the whole coronavirus pandemic is so many people stuck at home looking at the phone, looking on these websites much more often. The amount of people who are falling for random conspiracy theories who I never would have thought before is just astonishing. And I think it's just gotten out of control. People just don't. I think it's not just digital literacy, but also media literacy now, and just people not really knowing how to critically assess what they're reading and what they're seeing online. I think that's a big part of it as well.
Just rounding back on the moderation, you're right. The platforms moved remarkably quickly with the Christchurch Christchurch massacre. And Lizzie, I wonder if that is actually showing that it is possible to have a moderation framework if platforms are prepared to invest in people behind it. I think one of the problems with algorithmic moderation, and it again came through in this TikTok suicide video, was that the video was front-ended with some fairly benign images, so the AIs weren't picking it up as a violent thing automatically. And so does this become, a real thing that you need to have teams of people that are actually there, fast turnaround, moderating content rather than just sort of waiting for the extreme thing to happen?
Totally. I mean, I absolutely think that's what they should be doing, and they largely pretend it's not their problem, and they describe themselves as kind of neutral platforms for that content. I mean, one of the things I think is that there are a lot of people in groups that I'm in online that spend huge amounts of time in their spare time, unpaid, moderating these groups. And I think it is really interesting when you think about all that unpaid labour that they're doing, making that safe that space safe, because the platform isn't doing that. And I do think there's some utility in thinking about it in that way. Maybe we should have a community-based approach to moderation. And if we are treating this like a utility rather than a private company, then that is probably the future, having people who are local and specific to moderating content for that purpose. And with things like children's content made specifically for children, things like YouTube Kids, I think if you're going to set up a channel or a platform like that, you have to take on the extra responsibility of moderation. It's just completely unacceptable to shirk that responsibility in any way. But there's a lot bigger questions than that, I think. And ultimately, that's why I think it is a utility. And we need to start thinking about why these companies aren't really entitled to the immense profits they make. And actually, lots of people contribute to making it an interesting place to be. And the best bits of these platforms are often because people contribute to them, and spend huge amounts of time doing so, and they're undervalued and under-recognised, and that should be part of the discussion.
Kind of adjacent to that discussion as well, something that I've been sort of keeping a close eye on is the ongoing attempts to hold Google and Facebook in particular liable for what their users post on there. Obviously media companies are now copying it for stuff that is in the comments on their posts on Facebook and things like that. But we're starting to see a steady stream of lawsuits directed at Google initially to get the names of reviewers and things like that. But it would be interesting to see if as part of the defamation changes that they're being brought in, whether if there's a possibility that Google or Facebook could be held liable for the comments that people post, whether there'll be some sort of moderation functionality introduced into that, and whether they'll be part of it or whether they'll expect news companies to be part of that. I think that's another interesting thing to be watching the next few months.
Sarah Butcher's got a great comment in chat about the film The Cleaners. I don't know if you're there, Sarah, and you want to sort of give people the 2-minute version. It is a great doco.
Yes.
Hi there.
Hi. Yes, I had the privilege of watching it actually at a privacy conference a couple of years ago. And it's essentially about how Facebook have outsourced the moderation of the sort of content we're talking about to essentially sweatshops in developing countries. It was focused on the Philippines, and it was really quite horrifying at the lack of support for those employees who are not really employees in the traditional Western sense, who are having to make split-second decisions to delete content or not. And I query or wonder if we're thinking about the big tech companies moderating, whether this, it absolutely shocked me. And I don't think necessarily this sweatshop outsourcing is the way forward.
Unless you're Facebook trying to say you're moderating without spending much dough, I suppose. But,
exactly.
It does. But, I think Lizzie's idea of, you've got one of the largest, wealthiest companies in the world with a clear problem that requires people at a time when we're hitting this huge employment crisis around the globe. So it'd be interesting to think what a company that really wanted to make the world a better place would do with that sort of challenge in front of them.
It's a little like the sort of what we've learned out of coronavirus at the moment, where, the most dangerous aspects of the people who we're putting in most danger of getting the virus are the people who are most critical to it. So healthcare workers, frontline workers, food delivery people and things like that. And it's similar for that, this highly important function that these companies do have been left to their lowest paid and their poorest paid, where you should be skilling these people up, giving them appropriate support, bringing them inside the company, and that would actually, I think, bring about real change in the way they do things.
And just one other little factoid I was going to throw in, and we're not going to dwell on it, but it was interesting this week. Facebook was in front of an inquiry into its handling of the 2019 federal election, where Facebook said that revealed Facebook and its external partners had fact-checked a grand total of 17 news articles during the campaign. And this is the other bit around, that whole Facebook's role in politics. Does it have a responsibility for truth in political advertising or not? And they clearly don't think they do.
And just some of the politicians, Craig Kelly constantly, posting about hydroxychloroquine and all this stuff on his Facebook page and just going unchecked. I understand the reluctance to, in particular, fact check politicians because that would be seen to be taking a side. But Twitter's done it to Trump's great annoyance. But I think when they're going to do this and have the platforms that they do, and Craig Kelly, who is a backbench politician, is getting a lot of engagement on his posts. You have to start thinking about what are the flow-on impacts of that.
A lot. I mean, isn't he, if you took off mainstream news article sharing, isn't he the most popular on Facebook? I mean, I think there's all sorts of difficulties with the idea of fact checking, to be honest, because who then becomes the arbiter of truth? Some of these things are contested. What might be considered heresy at one point then becomes truth later for good reasons. So it is a complex issue. And sometimes I think the obsession, from mainstream media platforms about fact checking, or Donald Trump's told this many lies during his presidency, it kind of falls flat because it doesn't really get at what's going on there, which is a kind of approach to politics, which is appealing to a particular demographic. And there may be other ways in which you can tackle it. And I think Twitter could do more, but I think the fact that they did do something has kind of struck a chord with lots of people and made them feel better about that platform as compared to, say, Facebook. And I think there are ways in which you can preserve the kind of freedom of expression while also flagging for people that they need to think carefully about what they're consuming. And you can contribute to that in design ways, but there are bigger problems as well that are difficult for a platform itself to solve.
Yeah. Hey, James, Paulick's got a great comment on the moderation, almost by analogy with recent history. Hi, James. You there? Wow. He said he was going to jump on. I'll give him one more sec. Otherwise, so he was talking about how the lobbyists for e-commerce and freight companies.
I
did. Yeah. We'll go to Craig. I've got him unmuted too. He had a great question. You there, Craig?
Yep.
Hello.
Hey, hello there. So services like Facebook, as Lizzie mentioned, enormous value to the users. Is a publicly funded organization setting up a service like Facebook a possible approach? The data that companies like Facebook collect must be absolutely invaluable. There's never been such data collected on human behavior, probably ever. So if users don't trust private companies, what about a public body with regulated transparency?
It is kind of the crux of the thing that will people move away from Facebook because they're moving away from their existing networks. And I personally think there'd be a huge interest in having a platform that we organised ourselves that wasn't a private company that was harvesting our data for commercial ends. Should it be government owned? Depends on the strength of your democracy. Should it be a mutual? Should it be something that, out of the, Lizzie's written on the histories of movements, and out of the Industrial Revolution became a whole mutual movement. Do we need to be moving to, platforms that we all have a stake in? I don't know, but I'd love the conversation. And I think if we're not raising those questions, then the power of the platforms is as much as it is today.
I don't think I'd trust the government to be able to do it properly. and B, just not do something wrong with it in terms of the handling of the data. You saw the whole debate around MyGov and eHealth records and the contact tracing, the COVID Safe app. A good portion of the public are, wary of the government. And I think it is right that people will go where their existing networks are, and that has to happen semi-organically, I think. The rise of TikTok kind of caught a lot of people by surprise. It went from preteens to teens and now adults to it, and it's coming that way. But that will in no way ultimately replace Facebook. It's one of those things that it's hard to see any particular platform building up. But then again, we went from MySpace to Facebook. So
I know, that's what I was about to say. I mean, the popularity of these platforms can be very brittle, because MySpace is a perfect example of that. I mean, I do think there is a role to play for public spending. It doesn't have to be government owned, I think. Something like the BBC or the ABC, I think, give you an insight into what that might look like. Like, the government doesn't track, well, I don't know whether they do, but what you're watching on iView, for example, or you don't expect that they would, and it would be a scandal if they did. But it's obviously a publicly funded body with its own independent board. I mean, politics comes into the ABC, just like it does any kind of platform, especially one that receives money from the government. But there are ways to limit its worst successes that would be, of course, I think, a step forward from outsourcing this to private industry. And then there's other examples. Glenn in the chat talked about Wikipedia, which I think is a fantastic example, one of the world's most popular websites, and huge amounts of volunteer contribution to it, a small foundation that kind of monitors it, but people who have ways of content moderation of sorts, to working out what to put on the particular page, that is largely decentralized, largely a form of democracy. I mean, it doesn't always work, of course, but it's a very interesting example, a living, breathing one, of how you can structure a very good, very popular website based on people contributing because they see its social utility, without making one person heaps and heaps and heaps of money, and centralizing that approach to making money through extracting data from users. So I think we do have alternatives that are floating around. I think this is absolutely the time to be talking about it before others get to say what it looks like.
And in a way, by threatening to leave the country, Facebook has actually opened up the discussion. So if they're saying we don't want to be here anymore, we're not going to cover news in Australia, then maybe this is the moment to think through, well, what does life without Facebook look like? It seems to me that on the ABC thing, I kind of had this crazy dream that ABC wasn't just putting out news, but it was providing a platform for community sport and community theatre and local, a bit like what they do with Unearthed in a way, but you could actually see a non-control and command public platform that was encouraging people to do their civic and their social life by offering the tools that then that would almost fulfill the need that's being filled by Facebook, but within a very individual consumer way at the moment. So I think there are some really interesting models that we kind of are incumbent in getting our heads around.
ABC in particular is probably fairly well geared to do that, because they're basically in every community and things like that. They're already there to build it up. So I think that, if you're going to do something like that, then that would be the best avenue to pursue it.
Yeah. And in my sense, ABC still very much sees itself as a broadcaster like ABC. And I know the charter says that, but why is ABC just putting information out? Why isn't ABC responsible for bringing community information back into government using the same principles of independence? Not state control information, but if you want to know what people are thinking about in Nowra, why are you hiring heaps of community consultants to go out rather than creating something organic, which is a genuine two-way information flow within communities? And you see that if you built that out over a decade, you'd have something that feels a bit like a national social network that wasn't doing surveillance capitalism.
Sounds like a great idea.
I have a dream. Anyway. Speaking of surveillance capitalism, the hottest show on Netflix at the moment, number one, is what I sort of dubbed in the intro social capitalism for dummies. But it's actually an attempt to tell the story of the profound failure of big tech through the eyes of some of the tech bros who created the problem. it's easy to dismiss this. It's called The Social Dilemma for people that haven't seen it. It's on Netflix if you've got Netflix. It's an hour and a 2-hour doco, very well produced, which is basically a telling of the surveillance capitalism framework. Shoshana Zuboff, who's written the book around it, is one of the narrators, but it's really around this guy, Tristan Harris, who started, I think, at Google, Lizzie, and then set up the Centre for Humane Technology. And it kind of tells the story of all these guys who are working in tech and then realised how messed up the world was becoming. And so they're talking about it. But is that a fair summation of it?
I think you've done a very good
It's not terrible. It's not terrible.
No. I mean, the context is that we were talking about this before we came on, and I think I'm extra cynical. I mean, I think there's a lot that's good about it, and I wouldn't want to discourage people from watching it, but I think you should watch it with a bit of your critical faculty still in play. Something about this feels about 3 years older than it ought to be, because a lot of these discussions were being had a while ago, and often by very interesting people that aren't featured in the doco. Some of the people in the doco I'm very fond of, and I think have made really interesting contributions. I think everyone should read Cathy O'Neill's book, for example. It's a really good insight into how bias and algorithms works. But one of the frustrations I have is that someone like Tristan Harris is held up as the conscience of Silicon Valley, because he designed a bunch of products that turns out don't actually work as he intended. And that's the kind of overwhelming feeling you have. All these execs with regrets, all these designers of programs and products that turned out didn't quite match the maker's dreams. And now we've got the answers for how to solve it. And you should listen to us if you want to get out of this problem. And something about that really grates on me, because I think lots of people could have seen these problems coming. I think the fact that the people who are in the design rooms were often, white men is part of the problem. And so then having to listen to them all talk about how this problem is kind of unable to be expressed. Like, there's a point in the documentary where they literally cannot describe what the problem is. And I think it's pretty clear what the problem is: a profit motive applied to people's personal spaces, their lives, and a desire to colonize that and make money from your psychology. And that's an enormous problem that I think many have been talking about this for quite some time. And a few small people have made billions of dollars from this profit model. So, I think it's pretty clear that we need to fix that in a pretty radical way. And I think there's interesting things you can learn from the documentary, but I can also understand why it is a bit infuriating at various points. And there's been some great commentary on why that's the case.
Yeah, I must say I read the criticism of privileged white males coming late to the party, and I did sort of self-reflect a little bit as well, Lizzie. But, you're
earlier to the party than them. Don't worry.
Those voices of challenging, like as Glenn's saying, Sean Parker, one of the founders of Facebook, talking about how toxic it is. It does carry some weight.
Sure.
What they do with it now, and I guess, Josh, the frustration of that, of the doco is that it kind of says, here we are, and then they can't quite either name the problem or name any sense of a solution.
Yeah, it seems to be all, big bad algorithm, scanning everything you want to do, everything like that. I had friends much less offline, much less tuned into the everyday news cycle, friends recommending it to me over Facebook, no less. And I went into it going, I'm going to know everything that they talk about in this. And sure enough, I did, which is fine. But I find the evangelism around it a little bit frustrating. Getting people to be more aware of what they're doing, what they're sharing and what they're doing on Facebook is good. But a little bit what Lizzie's saying before, it's like people have been screaming this for years and years and years. And now you're just starting to pay attention because it's packaged up nicely in a Netflix documentary, which also worth noting, Netflix uses an algorithm to determine what you like and then recommend it to you. And that is completely overlooked in the documentary, I thought. So, there is the fact that you're paying
so the case for this is, in terms of exposing these ideas to a much broader audience than the 130 people that are in today's tech, a really compelling telling of and stating of where we are. I thought it did a really good job there, as long as it's a conversation starter and it's not just, here's the doco, here's our awards, and then we move on. It's kind of really interesting to see where that can go.
I mean, I think there is always going to be kind of moral panics around new technology, and some of, this is what lots of critics of this film have said. Some of that will be overblown, some of it will be legitimate, and figuring out which of those various things fall into is the task of, kind of critical thinkers and people who want to change the world for the better. And so, there's a very frustrating moment where Tristan Harris says, "Oh, nobody worried about the bicycle when it was invented, that it was going to ruin the world." And of course, that's just probably false. And part of the impression that you get from this is a lot of these execs haven't read a book in quite some time. And, there was a moral panic around bicycles, for example, particularly around women's use of them. And of course, it's turned out to transform society in lots of different ways that are unexpected, some that were expected, but, the moral panic has subsided. And I think this kind of, you have to approach these discussions with a bit of history and context. And it can be a bit frustrating when this is the glossy, very slick presentation of how we should understand this problem, not necessarily grappling, I think, with the complexity of it. The other thing I would say, and it has been raised by others as well, is that it doesn't really talk about the wonderful things of the internet and what they look like. And that is really missing. So it's seen as someone made this comparison on Twitter that it's treated more like cigarettes than, say, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So it's just bad. It's all bad. And we need to, companies, we need to find a technical solution to it, rather than something that has potential to be liberating and amazing, and figuring out how we pass that out to maximize the latter. That's a really difficult question. But, you can imagine that if you were a young kid growing up in a very religious southern state in the United States, being able to, and you were not straight, you were identifying as queer, how liberating it might be to find people online who were like you that didn't look like your local community. It's a source of immense potential there, and we have to acknowledge that. And let's find ways to help those people find it to be a liberating tool, rather than treat it as necessarily something that makes us worse, which is the overwhelming feeling, I think, when you watch the doco.
So I'll throw this on you, Lizzie, because one of the really interesting moments, they ask a lot of them, so what is the problem? And there's kind of dead air. What is the problem, Lizzie?
Well, look, I mean, I understand why it's difficult to articulate. I've written a book about this, so it took me 80,000 words to describe the problem. But in the course of that, I also tried to describe potential solutions. I think the problem is the profit motive, primarily, that incentivizes people creating platforms of addiction, that prioritizes time on a device and engagement, and incentivizes colonization as well of all your physical and psychological spaces, that wants to be taken over and turned into a commodity for selling to advertisers. And that's a very big problem. There are other problems as well, including the involvement of the surveillance state, which is also something that's kind of underexplored in the documentary, and the relationship between tech companies and government surveillance is I think, woefully underexplored. And so there's lots of other problems that exist outside of that profit motive. But I think until you start to contend with that, I don't think you can really understand what kind of dynamics led to where we are today. And I don't think they do. They do talk a little bit about the profit motive, and I don't mean to misrepresent them, but I don't think they fully contend with how it leads to these things. And so shareholder value needs to be contended with. We need to find a way to stop prioritizing profit over the public interest, and that might involve, thinking outside of a market-driven model, and that's ultimately what I think we need to do.
How would you fill the dead air on that question, Josh?
I think that's largely the point. It's always been about getting the eyeballs, keeping people on the platform for as long as possible, and then making money out of them. And I think that is partly addressed in the documentary. But I think it was a bit of an oversimplification. Some of my friends came out of watching that documentary, and were basically saying, "Look, I'm cutting out my social media. I'm deleting these apps from my phone. I'm doing stuff like that." And I'm saying to them, "You're in the middle of a pandemic. You're not able to see anyone else. I understand that you might feel parts of the platforms are toxic and shouldn't be used, but you're essentially cutting off a lot of your contact with the outside world." You have to realize that, until we actually have a better system in place, and I think that's something that would probably take about 80,000 words to discuss. Until you have something better in place, you kind of have to just be aware of how your information is being used and what's being collected on you and what they're trying to do to you, and then moderate as you need. I don't think you can sort of cut off your leg essentially to save everything else.
being a bit older than you two, I do remember the world before the dot-com crash, where there was basically all this money going into the internet, but no business model. And it was actually awesome. Like, there was like no pretense of making money out of us. They were just giving us more and more stuff. So we need to go back to pre-dot-com bust world, I reckon, to have any hope of reimagining the web. So maybe that can be the next stimulus to get us out of this mess we're in at the moment. I don't know.
I think the interesting thing is that the premium that's placed on privacy now, essentially, because you know, Apple's just rolled out iOS 14, and that gives you much more control over what apps are doing and how they're using your data and things like that. But it does come at a price. You're going to pay more for an Apple device than you would, say, a Google device or things like that. And Google is getting better with the privacy controls, but it is interesting to see that I guess that fight between Apple and the Google and Facebook in particular over what your data is worth, and Apple saying, you know, we want you to keep your data, whereas these other companies are saying, no, that's how we make our money.
Yeah. Hey, we're winding down the hour. I'm just going to is Lucy still on the line? I was just going to give her the floor just to give a plug to Net Thing in a couple of weeks. Are you there? Because that's the next time we'll be back with the Tech Talk. There's a 2-day conference called Net Thing coming up in a couple of weeks. Do you want to give the 2-minute version, Lucy?
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Thanks for the shameless plug. Alrighty. Yeah. So in 2 weeks, we're gonna be spending Thursday and Friday online with the Net Thing, which is basically a forum to have all these discussions in various different Q&A, panel, and workshop formats. It's online. You can register for free. So I'll touch base with Peter to make sure a link to that is circulated. There will be an Australia at Home Friday discussion that will be a part of it that you can enter separately or as a part of your ticket. So if you're sitting around like we are in Melbourne with not much else to be going on in the outside world, I think it's a great place just to learn about everything from the infrastructure challenges, connectivity, to the content and internet governance in general. So it's a good place to go.
And I've just put a link to the website, which will tell you there's 12 days, 19 hours, 1 minute and 43 seconds to go. So it's getting close. Hey, thanks guys. Thanks Josh for joining us today. It was great to tap your brain.
Nice.
And Lizzie, only another couple of weeks to go and you'll be out in the fields running around, I hope.
Yep.
Next week, we've got the Geek Fest on Tuesday. We're launching a report into the rental market on Thursday. And then also just one for the diary, which we'll send out. We have got our glorious Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, Tuesday the 29th, launching Per Capita's book, What Comes Next. So a few things in the calendar for you guys to get part of it. Thanks for being part of it today. Have a great weekend. Stay strong, those of you in Melbourne. And yeah, we'll see you all again very, very soon. Cheers.